hybrid. Yeah. The hybrid. Yeah. The hybrid. Yeah. The hybrid.
Have you ever wondered if cannabis policy could shape the world of gaming? In today's episode, we're diving into the surprising connections between these two regulated industries, from licensing to public health to data surveillance, and exploring what gaming regulators can learn from cannabis, or vice versa. We'll have a special guest for that discussion, plus some behind-the-scenes stories, and a summer debate about the best cannabis-enhanced activity. Think golf or concerts or camping, and of course, a trivia showdown to wrap things up. Curious yet? Let's get started. Welcome to The Hybrid. I'm Shawn Collins, here with my co-host Erik Gundersen, and we are so glad you're joining us as we explore the fascinating world of cannabis policy, politics, and pop culture. As former regulators who've worked closely with this industry, we are here to share insights in a way that's supposed to be engaging and thought-provoking. Whether you're a policy enthusiast, a business professional, or someone who enjoys just a fun pop culture debate, we've got a little something for everyone each and every episode. Today, we're going to unpack a question that might spark some fresh ideas. Can cannabis policy help guide gaming policy? We're joined by Mackenzie Slade from CPPC and GPPC, and she'll explain what those are, who brings a wealth of knowledge on gaming regulation and, of course, cannabis policy and regulation. Together, we're going to dig into those industries and how they align, where they differ, and what it means for the future. You'll hear some new perspectives, a few surprises, and some behind-the-scenes stories from our regulatory days woven into the discussion. We're also bringing a bit of summer fun into the mix. With warmer days ahead, we're debating the best summer activity to enjoy with cannabis. Imagine golf with a pre-roll to help you unwind, or concerts with edibles for a great vibe, or camping with a vape to relax under the stars. We'll share our favorites, and we'd love to hear yours. Drop us a note on Instagram at The Hybrid Pod. To wrap things up, we've got a little bit of trivia. That sure is going to be a blast with Mackenzie joining in. It's supposed to be a friendly competition, but maybe Erik will finally outsmart me. Or will he take the win? We'll see. You'll have to listen, I guess, to find out. So we'll also share some thoughts on where this cannabis gaming connection might lead us next. So grab your headphones, settle in, and let's dive into episode 3 of The Hybrid. It's going to be a thoughtful, fun episode. So we're going to jump right into the heart of today's episode and talk some policy. We're tackling the big question: can cannabis policy be a blueprint for gaming policy? We couldn't ask for a better guide and guest to help us navigate this topic than our special guest, Mackenzie Slade. Mackenzie's definitely a true expert in both gaming and cannabis policy, and of course, she brings a really fresh perspective to this podcast. So Mackenzie, welcome to The Hybrid. And maybe to start off, you can tell us a bit about yourself, the work of CPPC, and maybe your vision for GPPC. So let's dive in.
Yeah, thanks so much. Happy to be here. My name is Mackenzie Slade. I am the CEO of Cannabis Public Policy Consulting and separately Gaming Public Policy Consulting. And I'm an implementation scientist, which means that I study how the design of programs, policies, interventions sort of affect real world outcomes and implementation outcomes. It's an evaluation science. It's very similar to just studying efficacy, essentially. And so we've been doing that in cannabis policy for nearly 6 or 7 years at this point, better half of a decade, and have recently entered the gaming space last year. I'm just really excited to sort of jump in and talk about both things and the parallels and the way they can learn from one another.
I mean, I think that's a really great place to start, right? Is what parallels are there? It seems like we've talked about this before. It seems like they're following incredibly similar paths, not necessarily like gaming policy per se, but like the new novel online component of gaming, where it all of a sudden happened a few years ago. There seems to be this huge void or deficiency in hard data, understanding the impacts of these policies. And I think we went through that same thing with a number of early states that legalized, just kind of making decisions, putting policies, regulations together, making decisions off of just anecdotal data, hearsay, conversations. And that's part of really what CPPC did, and certainly helped me in my time as executive director in Maine, was to put like hard data and science behind those decisions and informing what we were doing on day to day. So, I mean, is that a similarity? Is that something that where gaming regulators are currently could learn from cannabis, should be looking for that information, should be better understanding like these new novel ideas of online gaming, how it's actually impacting their populations?
Yeah. I mean, I think you've hit the nail on the head in that both industries really have a data deficit and just like a general problem with really understanding the nuances and complexities of addiction and what that looks like as it relates to policy and how to inform policy and programs. I think it's probably worth mentioning that like gaming and gambling go back to the early civilization. Like it's not exactly like when we say can the gaming industry learn from cannabis, it's like, well, it's been established since the beginning of time, right? I think like Gerald Ford was the president when the first license was issued for a casino. So like it's been quite established. What I think is happening now that's interesting is that it's at this pivotal point where it's really entered the public discourse with that of sports betting and online gaming and the more like cultural zeitgeist around what people do in isolation and more of a behavioral addiction that was not necessarily a topic of priority in the past, right? Like responsible gaming had been around for quite some time, these efforts to make sure that gambling and gaming had elements of public health. But now it's become a very, very hot topic because it is a sort of recency bias with all of the legislation being passed for sports betting. And there is extremely limited data. I think that one of the reasons why GPPC we formed it was because for two reasons. Same thing for cannabis. There was really no surveillance outside of NISDA, the National Survey on Drug Use and Health, which if you're not familiar with NISDA, phenomenal team and program. And they issue data they collect data and issue it about like on a 2-year delay. So it was kind of like the most recent, I believe at this point is 2022. And so it was really hard to keep up with trends that were sort of outpacing our ability to utilize these really incredible surveillance programs. And so federal regulators, state regulators for cannabis who, may not have backgrounds in research to begin with, were getting very limited data. And the data that they were using were pretty much just prevalence stats, like how much of your community is consuming cannabis and at what frequency. And those were about 2 years old, right? So there was just very limited information for them to make decisions off of. It's very similar to that of gaming, but I would say even worse because there is no version of NISDA. There is no sort of surveillance that's happening to understand gambling behaviors and gaming behaviors. There's a few surveys that are issued by the National Council on Problem Gambling that are wonderful. But at the end of the day, trying to make data informed policy is really challenging when you don't have the ability to say, this is very specific to my state. This is very specific to my policy environment, right? And so that's sort of where GPPC and CPPC came to play. No pun intended.
It's interesting because I'm glad you brought up sort of the CPPC and GPPC, and I guess it's our work together was around CPPC, but I obviously having recently started the gaming portion of that. From a parallel standpoint, do you find that state regulators, knowing that they're different, right? You've got your cannabis sort of commissions and boards, et cetera, and your gaming boards. The parallels, do they sort of break down into the policy development side of things too, where a lot of your work is supporting those regulators to make informed decisions? And you mentioned sort of the data collections and those things, but I'm just wondering, from a business standpoint, from your business standpoint, are you seeing a lot of similar questions, similar thoughts, similar planning, and maybe a little bit of like, where do things diverge too? Like, because they're not the same, obviously heavily regulated, but cannabis being a substance, gaming being sort of an offering, a program, a business. I guess just looking to see in your own work if you're seeing a lot of parallels between the two.
Yeah, I would say from like the regulator standpoint, they're vastly, vastly different. I think, and largely because I think when we started legalizing cannabis, there was this position of immediately we have to be on the defense for public health. We have to sort of figure this out and start from a very conservative position. And I think because of that, the regulators in cannabis really see themselves as stewards of public health. And I would say that they absolutely are. I think that in gambling, it's a little bit different. In gambling, it was always a tourism economy, right? So a lot of the regulatory approaches are really to support this idea of tourism and entertainment and hospitality, that is maybe not so public health centric. There's a lot of lawyers in that field, not to say there's not in cannabis, but it's just a very different position that they're coming from, and that I think the regulators see themselves as. So from a work perspective, I think in cannabis, what's actually interesting is a lot of the data that we've used over time has evolved away from focusing specifically on public health, which was really sort of where I got in this as a public health professional, and more into like the economics and the legislation and the policy of it all, the market dynamics. And I think that's probably because that's the way that cannabis is going, because we did such a good job with public health. I think that that's like actually a telling story in and of itself, right? Like we started CPPC to be very much in the public health focus, and it inevitably over time shifted into a more economic market dynamic, because public health, not to say that everything's perfect in PG, it's surely not, but it is sort of, okay, we started from a position that actually ended up quite leaving us in a better position. For gambling, it seems like it was kind of the opposite. Responsible gaming was sort of a facet of the industry, but it wasn't the focus. And now they're sort of seeing themselves be put in this position of, oh gosh, we're at this sort of cross section of, are we a part of a public health industry or not? And how do we go about that? And so you'll see a lot of the states right now are trying to roll back a lot of policies that they've already implemented, which from a public health and harm reduction standpoint, there are benefits and drawbacks of that. So they're kind of like starting and ending on the same note.
I wanted to ask a question about like what current data sets exist in gaming compared to cannabis, but you brought up an interesting point, which states right now are considering rolling back certain policies. And am I understanding you correctly when they're doing that because they're looking through these online gaming initiatives or laws through a public health lens when they weren't initially? Am I understanding that correctly?
I think they're looking at it from a quasi public health lens, and here's why I say that. Right now, there's such a really, really like the sky is falling type of narrative happening with sports betting specifically, and online gaming. Anything that's like a mobile opportunity is being really painted as like a doom-laden moral panic type of environment. And so I think a part of it is that I don't want to say like but regulators and legislators and advocates are hearing about these really harrowing tales in the media and thinking, oh, this is the industry. This is what everyone will inevitably experience. This is a very classic picture of gambling or gambling addiction. And so they're using that very limited information, that very limited data, and making maybe overarching claims in justifying rolling back some of their approaches. But when you actually look at the data for what's happening in problem gambling and what, the reason why there's a difference between problem gambling and gambling disorder and all the screening tools, and it's so much more of a complex landscape. And I'll say this, Mike and I are working on a paper right now related to...
Mike?
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Michael Sofitz, Dr. Michael Sofitz.
I mean, I know Mike.
The infamous. Yeah, Mike is, for those who don't know, Mike is a behavioral psychologist from Dartmouth's School of Technology, something or another, that works on surveillance methods for data collection in vice fields. Anyway, he was the original director of research for CPPC and GPPC. We're working on a paper right now investigating the sort of linguistic tone that's being used in media reporting across all vices to try and understand how that influences the public narrative. And we can say categorically what's happening in the gambling landscape. The reporting on it is considered voyeuristic. And so I think that because there's such limited data and such limited information out there, that this sort of whole narrative that's being really depicted in the media is making a lot of movement, some in great direction. Like there's some things that are just common sense that would help public health outcomes or would help protect consumers or players in that fashion. But there are some things that really there's no evidence to support that this is a good idea, right? Like rolling back sports betting, Vermont putting in legislation to repeal sports betting and other forms of gambling. That is a terrible solution. And like I'll just say it point blank, that's not a great approach. Particularly because, much like cannabis, the gaming market is experiencing prolific illicit apps. And not just illicit apps, but illicit opportunities. Now I mean, and I'm sure this has been happening for a while, but just because now that I collect data on this, I can say that there are illicit machines being placed around the country. So it's not even just these online opportunities. The illicit market for gambling has become prolific.
And I think that's something probably people listening don't know. Like I didn't know that until a few months ago. I always put myself in the position saying I'm not an advocate for legalization, but if we're going to do it, let's do it smart. Let's do it responsibly. And the other thing that I would say, particularly like local leaders, because Maine, when we legalized cannabis, we're a very local control and municipalities were able to opt in. I would always say like, look, you need to do what's right for your town. But at the end of the day, like there's a cannabis market happening within your borders, like whether it's legal or not. I was surprised to find out that gaming had such this illicit market, this underground market. So what you're saying is basically if we're using Vermont for the example, if they're to roll back their sports betting, no longer have a legal way to do that, people are still going to do it anyway with these illicit apps you can download on your iPhone or actually like in person, old school, smoky room. You're saying all of the above, right?
Yeah, all the above. I mean, so, it's even more complex. And I kind of make it a parallel to that of like what cannabis goes through with hemp and these, intoxicating cannabinoids that are everywhere and THC9, but it's hemp. It's a little bit like that, what's happening with gaming and gambling. And what that is that there are these sweepstake models that aren't really illicit, but they are at the federal level. They are not regulated in the same fashion that other sort of apps are. And so there are sports sweepstakes apps where you could effectively buy coins to utilize to gamble and then get real cash prizes from that, right? But that's not gambling. You didn't wager any real money. So there's a number of different avenues by which they could essentially fill the gap through illicit or unregulated means. The sweepstakes acts being one of them. Other ways are, of course, the old school bookies. I actually got into gambling as a curiosity because I have my uncle used to keep book, and I have memories of this. And
our next guest is Mackenzie's uncle.
We should dig into that one a little bit more.
Yeah, there's some stories there. Immigrants from Sicily for sure. But the sort of, I think what's interesting about all this is that it's not just these illicit apps or these unregulated apps, because there are both. There are also the complexities of not being able to enforce upon those apps. So for anything that is, has an offshore host, you need federal intervention to be able to prosecute. So all the states can do is regulators can do is submit cease and desist and ask for federal intervention to help. But because they're all offshore apps, like the path forward is extremely challenging. And so the same conversation that was happening in cannabis of like the only way to beat the illicit market is to legalize. I don't know how salient that message is anymore. However, I will say for gaming, that's probably right. Just based on the vast volume of illicit gambling. And I'll say one other thing about this is that it's also, we're seeing people utilize VPNs, and the sports betting apps, based on state regulations, they're supposed to have geolocations and they have a bunch of compliance features to make sure that you're in the state. There's a ton of sophisticated ways to get around that, and that's no fault of the apps or the sports books themselves. It's really just the sophistication of the internet these days. So there's a ton of people in California specifically and Texas specifically, where sports betting is not accessible, who are in our data collection, we found that are utilizing both VPNs and social media to place their bets, specifically for sports betting. And so with that data, you're kind of like, okay, that's interesting. We're kind of proving the point right now that they, at this point in time, might benefit from a regulated market access than that of not having one, because just based on the prevalence of those doing illicit acts from this is profound.
Is that, oh, I'm sorry, Shawn, you got a question?
More of a comment or an observation, just because I think what I'm hearing is, first off, I think gaming to me is like a few different industries sort of rolled into a broader umbrella topic. So I think about this just sort of goes back to my days working in the state treasurer's office in Massachusetts, where we oversaw the state lottery. And I'm thinking like that's a form of gaming. And then you've also got like bingo and bingo halls that like senior centers are like, that's gaming too. And so I think for me, like I've always thought of gaming as being sort of, and you mentioned it, Mackenzie, like the resort casino, like the destination tourism aspect, but it's also sort of just been around us and sort of ingrained in society as far as like visible, where again, like you've got the lottery, you've got now we have sports betting. You had, I've also think about like fantasy sports, and I remember the surge pre-sports betting of like daily fantasy sports, like the emergence of DraftKings and FanDuel. And I think what I'm seeing though is sort of like a permissive culture of there's different mindsets or sort of psychologies that go into even say the lottery, for instance, where you have your draw games, which requires someone to be patient, to buy a ticket, to go home, to wait for the numbers to be called, versus your instant tickets, which is like that instant gratification of like, I need it now. Those are two different customers, right? Like, and you're marketing to those two different folks. But I also think that like sports betting has sort of introduced the concept of gaming to a new generation of folks that we're never going to play the lottery. Like, I'm not going to go buy a scratch ticket. It's not for me, but I will enhance my observation or my viewing of football on a weekend by betting on games. Or you also think about like March Madness, like how many offices have been hosting pools for years. Like that's illegal gaming. Like you're wagering money and someone's like, I hate to say, like Venmo is probably like a great resource to sort of monitor someone's gaming activity for like, I'm in a fantasy football league and I'm paying my $25 into the buy-in and I'm hopefully going to win that back. And I just think that we don't always think of that as being gaming, but it is. And I think again, sort of the psychology, but I'd love to get your thoughts on like there's addiction based on that. Like there's sort of like receptors going off. That's like something sort of like the dopamine effect of like, I've got like a lot riding on this game. Like there's like all of a sudden I'm interested in tennis. I don't know a lot about tennis. I just know I shouldn't be betting on it anymore because it's been awful for my parlays. All that said, I'm actually interested in tennis all of a sudden. And so is there any sort of from maybe a public health standpoint, but also just like I think about in cannabis, we're not looking, we have themes of regulations. Don't market to kids. Don't, manage or monitor youth access. Are there similar themes or pillars when it comes to legalizing gambling, or more specifically, sort of the new phenomenons of gambling, especially with the advent of internet access and that sort of stuff?
Yeah. Point well taken. It's gaming is an ecosystem, and that's why gaming is the more accurate term, and all of the legislation around gaming is considered gaming, right? Gambling is a facet of gaming, right? It's like Candy Crush is actually considered gaming. Like this, it's an ecosystem. I think what's fascinating about it is that it is like the wealth of where behavioral science exists and behavioral psychology exists, because there is no sort of pharmacological substance that you're inducing, that you're taking or consuming. It is strictly internalized. It is a dopamine reinforcement effect. And so I think that's why, just as a side note, I think that's why people are so fascinated by it, and it's so like relevant to today's world, is because of this like gross, almost like, again, voyeuristic like fascination with how you could be addicted to a behavior. Like how could that like, there's no obvious signal of like, oh yeah, you're addicted to opioids because you take opioids, right? So it's very fascinating. It's been truly the last year of just doing all of this research with Mike on it. Dr. Sophis, like I said, has been reinvigorated my passion for public health and behavioral science. To your question though, which was about
just sort of like the themes and the pillars from a regulatory standpoint. Like we know in cannabis, we're sort of following the outline of the Cole memo, and we've got like regardless of like state by state programming and regulatory development, there's a consistent theme of like what should be done, what shouldn't be done. Is the same true when it comes to whether it's sports betting or just sort of the modernization of gaming today? Again, like I think about, for instance, games of chance versus games of skill, and like those appeal to two different people, and like the patience of a draw game versus the instant gratification of a scratch ticket. Like you've got so many different customers, so to speak.
right. Okay, sorry about that. Sometimes I just start going, I don't know where I'm going to end up.
Same.
So for your question, yeah, I mean, games of skill and games of chance are regulated differently. That's pretty standard across the state. So like fantasy is regulated different than that of sports betting, even though you can make the argument that they're both really intensely skill based. As a person who knows nothing about sports and, you know, it can't be bothered to learn. They're both pretty intensive. For the regulations and the approaches to like sort of curtail poor outcomes and like prevent child interest and, you know, youth interest, et cetera. There are regulations like that, right? Like in terms of advertisements, which you can and can't advertise, and this, that, and the other thing. It's not as rigorous as cannabis. Cannabis takes it to a whole nother level, in my opinion. And for some states, I think they do a phenomenal job about it. In other states, I'm like, all right, we've gone a little bit too far. We don't need opaque plain packaging type of thing for every single piece of product. But that being said, there are efforts, and there have always been efforts, I think, especially with sports betting in particular and online gaming, because a lot of these apps that offer sports betting also offer online gaming, which would be like, I don't know, something of like online slots, and for some states, online casinos, things like that. So they do have protections that they have in place for regulations, but I think that they're not exactly as evidence-based as cannabis. Like in cannabis, we can say this is attractive to a child. You use cartoons, like that is very obviously attractive to a child. It's less obvious in gaming and gambling about what would be attractive to youth, right? Because like kids love sports. So how are you going right? So like, how are you going to be able to market something of that nature? But in cannabis, right, like a lot of states don't allow you to have celebrity endorsements. That's something that a lot of states try to eliminate the opportunity for. That is not the case for gambling. Oh my God, the amount of celebrities that are involved in a lot of these efforts. Yeah.
I was going to say, like, a certain gaming ad may not be like targeted, or I mean, there's subjectivity here to say, oh, that's targeting a child. But I would say the sheer volume of the advertising and marketing from the gaming space is insane. Like everywhere you look online, everywhere you look on TV, even if you listen to the radio, I mean, every once in a while I do, it's there. You
listen to the radio every once in a while?
Everyone, sports talk radio, that's about it. Yeah, if I'm not listening to your 12 other podcasts, Shawn. But like it's insane.
We'll put a link in the bio.
Yeah. But there's got to be some type of impact of that. You see it more than car commercials or any other type of advertisement.
One of the reasons for that, which I find fascinating, is that it's a write-off. Like you can expense your advertising costs. That's not allowed in other industries. And I'm not necessarily advocating for that to be the case, but it definitely plays a role in terms of like the sheer volume of advertisements, and like they're really everywhere. I will say that they have made, like, they're on my Uber app, like they're in places that I would never assume. And that's, by the way, like that's not just specific to, like, I want to keep coming back to the point of like these sportsbook operators. The lottery is on my phone. The New York State Lottery, I'm constantly getting hit with advertisements for them, and that's a state-run program. So it's not, the vilification of the industry seems to be very pointed at one area and one area only, which is sports betting or online gaming, which sports betting would be a part of the online sort of association for that. And it's simply not true. It is, like they have taken the heat for a broader industry. And yeah, I just sort of want to call that out. Sports betting in and of itself is an innocuous activity.
Well, and you see too, sort of the relationships and the partnerships that develop, and that's giving it a form of both endorsement, but I think also permission too. Like ESPN has an app; they're partnering with a gaming platform, and so you see these, and also, I mean, not to mention, like every major league has a formal partner, a sports betting partner that whether it be baseball or NBA or NFL, and actually some owners in the NFL and NBA and MLB are investors in some of these companies. So that like it's almost incestuous in a way, but it just goes to show, I think, the formality. But I would also argue, like you mentioned, Vermont rolling things back. I think it's going to be a lot more difficult for states to do that because it's so like formalized now and it's so entrenched and the partnerships are so real. And the thing is, like, wanting to bring your child to a baseball game or child to a football game, like there's a good chance you're going to sit in like the DraftKings section or like, and so it's just sort of around you. And I wonder how much of that becomes like, from an advertising standpoint, a prevalence standpoint, like, um, child psychology, like it's just sort of like you see it often enough, it just becomes, whether it's a curiosity. And then you mentioned like the celebrity endorsements, like I would argue a lot of our professional athletes are more geared toward kids today of like, those are my heroes, those are like, and they're on TV going like, download this app. And how many kids have a cell phone today? Like I wonder if one thing, I read this study back when I worked in treasury and we were sort of preparing for the advent of sports betting. Again, it was daily fantasy sports, and it was this sort of public health research paper, and it just stuck with me. It was basically like, you can lose your house from your couch. um that's terrifying. That's real. That's terrifying. Like, if I want to go buy a lottery ticket, I've got to get off my butt, get in the car, and go buy it. Like, I have to make a choice, like a decision to go. I could bet my house from my couch, and that's, again, that's terrifying. And are we matching resources on the problem gambling side sufficient that like we're making having any dent as far as like we're increasing the risk of harm for sure. Are we meeting that from a resource standpoint with support services, do you think?
Oh, we're certainly trying. I think the councils on problem gambling have never been more relevant and more sort of like able and justified to ask for more money. I think where I get tripped up is that public health has never really been a part of the conversation in gambling, and there's a number of reasons for that. It's not like to say that anyone pushed us out or that we were just like not interested. I think the number one reason why we've sort of been not engaged in this is because there is no federal level of intervention for gambling, which means there's no federal funding. And I'm not necessarily advocating for all of this, but I am acutely aware that in academia, which is the sort of primer of public health professionals, you have to gravitate to where there's funding. And there's just never been any funding for gambling. And I think a lot of that is because opioid use is, addictions with overdose are so much more important for us to solve in terms of where our money goes, return on investment wise. And so I think for resources, there's nothing really evidence-based yet. When it comes to intervention on problem gambling and intervention on more appropriately gambling disorder, engagement practices, curriculums, there's really nothing out there that is extremely evidence-based. And by the way, not a lot for cannabis either. It's a very new area, and cannabis use disorder affects more people worldwide and particularly in America than that of gambling disorder. And so I think that's an important message, right? About 6% of the country has exhibits forms of cannabis use disorder or meets the criteria for cannabis use disorder. For gambling disorder, it's between anywhere, and like, again, because there's such little data and the complications of collecting that data and screening people is so nuanced, it's anywhere between 1% to 5%. For the states. So I think that's important to note that like we have all this attention on gambling disorder and problem gambling. There are other addictive behaviors and addictive risk markets that are currently being stood up across the country that have a higher prevalence rate. Not to say that anyone should be prioritized over the other, but as it relates to prevention and intervention and focusing funding and resources, we do a pretty poor job across both.
Is there overlap, do you think, between those individuals? I would assume so, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, for gambling disorder specifically, there's a plethora of evidence to suggest that gambling disorder other disorders precede gambling disorder. So the comorbidities of substance use, cannabis use specifically is a big one, alcohol use, obviously. But as far as disordered behavior, substance use disorder, anxiety, depression, mental health conditions all precede gambling use disorder, or excuse me, gambling disorder.
So with the gambling use disorder, when you say anywhere from 1 to 5% of Americans have it, that's a snapshot in time. Do you think like we should be putting these additional resources in and doing this work and getting this data? Because there could be a swell of that kind of lagging behind this new online betting, sports betting, or have we already seen the impact of that, do you think?
It's a good question. There could be. The answer is there could be. The larger answer is that the screening tools and the diagnostic tools that we use to diagnose, because gambling disorder is a diagnosis, right? And so when we're doing prevalence studies that seek to understand the level of risk behaviors, we don't look at gambling disorder, we look at problem gambling, which are thresholds of risk. So I think one of the reasons why we can't really get the straight of what's the sort of truth about the area of problem gambling is because if you're looking, depending on what screening tool you're using and what report you're looking at, they're looking at those who are in moderate to severe risk, which would be a larger percent of the population, as opposed to those who have severe risk of problem gambling, which would then be likely to be gambling disorder. So the long and short of it is, yeah, we need surveillance to be able to know, but we also need to be better at having better screening tools, tested and valid tools that look at the efficacy and sort of cognitive testing of all the questions that we're asking, to really better understand gambling behaviors. Because unlike substance use disorder, like I keep going back to this, there is nothing that you are taking externally to be able to have this pharmacological effect. So there are other areas of like vulnerabilities that pre-exist, both substance use disorder and gambling disorder, that could be measured well in advance of your first stage of gamble, right? Like these ACE scores, we've done an excellent job studying childhood trauma and what that does for addictive behaviors. We've looked at decision-making fallacies and impulsivity, like all of these things we have data on. And I can tell you that based on the current data, what we're seeing that's being collected in high schools post-COVID, risk-taking behaviors are up for the same population. So just in and of that data point of itself, I can tell you that it is very likely that gambling disorder will increase, and it will have nothing to do with the availability or the legalization, but rather the pre-existing vulnerabilities that we seem to just continuously ignore.
That's
crazy.
ominous.
Yeah.
Damn.
We've
so
had the
much
same
chance.
reaction. All right. Good podcast over. We're all
on
bummed
that
out now.
note. Wow, where do you go from there? One thing you said though, I think is really worth sort of reinforcing though, is that the solution is not prohibition per se. And you sort of alluded to that in the last statement, as far as like even though it's more available, that may not be the sort of the root cause. Like there's other things that are factors here. But I do think it's worth noting though that like prohibition as a policy matter doesn't rid yourself of the product or the sort of the risk, right? Like it's the same is true for cannabis. We know that. And I just think that parallel is worth acknowledging and kind of reinforcing, is that, we need to balance the harms with, there are societal positives, and I'm sort of reticent to phrase it that way, but there's benefits that are earned or gained from the emergence of both industries. One is certainly jobs, and that's a relevant factor, revenue as well. But I also think that for those that are mature and sort of can balance that are still at risk, because I think everybody has a certain sort of element of risk here, there is an entertainment aspect to gaming. And like I said, I would never be attracted to a casino. I actually don't like the thought of gambling. Like I don't love risk, and I'm sort of more calculated that way.
Except for the 12-leg parlay from your couch.
But that's where I was going though, is like, that doesn't feel like gambling to me. That feels like entertainment. And like, for me, the low risk is like, I'm able to balance that risk by saying, I'll bet $5 on this game to make the game more interesting to me. Or I think, Mackenzie, we talked a little bit about like the game of skill versus game of chance. To me, I can enhance my odds by understanding sports better and knowing like, all right, this team is better, has a better record. This, some people take it way too far, as far as like the temperature's going to be in the mid 70s and there's like an overcast and the kicker is a lefty versus a righty. And like that to me is a little too far, but I think you can enhance your opportunity or sort of your odds all the same. Uh, I think I just wanted to dwell on the fact of like it's prohibition just sends it further underground. And to your point, like we're not looking to go back to the, pardon to your uncle, but like the days of bookies are certainly, it's a dying breed. I just worry. I think that sometimes the risk can be interpreted as like that it better be a no. Like we should disallow this activity. You're not doing any. You don't think you're protecting the person that is exposed to that risk. I think you're just making that risk even greater, frankly, sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, prohibition is, from a public health perspective, is not a policy solution for anything. It's just not. It does nothing. I think there's a lot of evidence that the sort of prohibitionist approach of like just say no had a really adverse effect. It not only did it not curtail consumption of drugs, but it also, in some cases, there's evidence to suggest that it had an adverse effect. People started consuming more, and this sort of like screw your paternalistic views type of thing. So yeah, I mean, prohibition itself is harmful.
I have a question. I think well, I'm going to find out from you whether it's more difficult for gaming regulators to address certain issues or deficiencies in the laws and regulations that they oversee. So we worked together in Maine. You knew I couldn't get my hands on enough cannabis data to be able to answer some difficult questions. But we had access to track and trace data, talking about one of the cornerstones. We had access to licensing data. We had access to cannabis specific data from different external agencies inside of state government, outside of state government. We worked with CPPC to do the surveys and had the surveillance data. We could use all of that, pull it all together to be able to tell a pretty detailed story and understand what was working, what's not, what's driving decision making, what's the impact of said policy. So that's all to say, like, what other sources of data can gaming regulators, like if I was a gaming regulator, I would be like, where can I get this data to start being able to tell a story and understanding the real impact of these things? And it seems like, and maybe it's because I've never been a gaming regulator, like the work that GPPC is doing is one of the only places that you would be able to get data to help inform the decisions that you're making it even more valuable, I guess. But tell me if I'm wrong.
No, I mean, say it again for the regulators in the back, please. No, I mean, to be honest, like there are other sources, of course, like the National Council of Problem Gambling puts out their, I think it's biannual. They do it every other year, study on gambling attitudes and behaviors. And that's a useful tool. Again, that is a national sample. That is, I think, I don't remember what the sample size is, but it's probably not enough data to make claims about any specific state or use it for predictive modeling. A lot of the states have, as part of their statutory requirements, that like the local colleges or universities will conduct research. I think one of the issues with that is when you, and this has always been the standpoint of why CPPC exists, is that academic data is phenomenal. Like I have such an envy for academics and like wish I was one of them, but I simply cannot be. But the same problems that exist with the NISDA exist with academic data, right? It takes a long time to collect that data. There is an obsession with precision that is incredible and rigorous. You have to do random address-based or RDD sampling. Like that procedure alone could take a year, and then you have to clean the data, and the data quality of an address base is so much worse than that of online panels. So there's all these different reasons and justifications as to why academic data takes so long, and also in academic training, you're usually very specifically looking at one very specific issue, and it is not data collected to be able to make inferences outside of that one limited scope that you were really interested in. What GPPC and CPPC offer is, look, we know that we're going to do this through online sampling. We're going to do everything we can to make sure that this is post-stratified weighted, that there's raking procedures, that there's all these things to make it academic, to mirror that of the census data. Epidemiologists might be like, no, online sampling is not ever useful. The fact of the matter is it's 1/16 of a cost for that of online sampling. And so we do it in a 3-week turnaround time. So the idea here is that these vice markets and the policies that you guys are, as regulators, were formally putting into place were happening so quickly. You don't have time to wait for data. You don't have time to sort of talk through all of these elements and utilize these like basically prevalence studies. But there are ways to collect it and say, you know, with this information and all the ways that we've made it, you know, valid and unbiased and fully scientific, we can make arguments, we can make claims, we can help have an idea of like what the single source of truth is and really sort of cancel out the noise. And as far as gambling goes, yeah, we're pretty much the only people who are asking questions that are founded in behavioral science and public health outside of the academics who are doing the much more rigorous, I would say probably like clinical areas of this research.
I think the real value in utility of that, though, is as regulators, Erik and I were, and our peers across the country, there's a bit of experiment related to our policy work. And I think the benefit is we want to be able to base those initial choices and decisions on something. And I think having that, and cannabis being, you know, relatively new from a public policy standpoint, we didn't have a ton to go off of. There weren't a lot of blueprints out there. Gaming has a bit more, as you mentioned earlier in the podcast, like a bit more of a history that we can rely upon, a bit more of a blueprint. Obviously, the legal structure has been evolving, but it's been legal federally. It's like there's a lot more sort of baseline to go off of. What I think the value that you and your team have brought to cannabis and now to gaming is sort of that monitoring work and sort of the how did we do and what should we change. And I think the one thing that regulators in both spaces deserve a lot of credit for is their willingness to adapt and evolve and fix if there's an area that needs fixing, or and share that information publicly and really sort of, we're making informed decisions, but we're also making informed updates to our statutes and to our laws and to our regulations. And I think the support of CPPC and GPPC in that effort is hugely invaluable. Like it's irreplaceable in some ways, just because it is, you can turn that information around quickly, you can gather it quickly, but it's also still reliable. And I think as policymakers, as regulators, we want to make those informed decisions, but we sort of need a basis to do it, and you're providing that basis. And I think that's where that service and that expertise has really supported a lot of regulatory programs across the country now in 2 different sectors that, like we talked about, have a lot of parallels and overlaps. So again, just I think seeing you in the gaming space is sort of reassuring for the policy going forward. So
thank you. That's very nice. I hope that. I mean, I will agree with you that the regulators have a much more open mind in terms of like moving forward. And I think that there's just so much public pressure. How could they not? So, for example, we worked with the state of New Jersey's, task force. Sorry, forgot the word for it. A task force on problem gambling. We put together a bunch of research for them, and they used it to make policy recommendations to the governor for sort of improving the landscape moving forward. But it's more than just surveillance. And I just want to like throw this out there because I think it's really important, because when we think of public health, we usually look at it as like a measurement tool, and surveillance does that. It's a measurement tool, right? But in gambling and cannabis specifically, I think there's a lot of opportunity for public health to be more central in things like interventions, in things like prevention, right? I'll give an example of, I'm on the subway and I see on the subway an ad from my state regulator, New York State, OCM, shout out them, but it was a subway ad for not to drive high. And I was like, about 70% of the people who will be exposed to this ad don't drive cars, right? Like things like that, like little things like that. Public health people can come in and help you identify really where you will get returns on investment for things as simple as campaigns. And so I just want to sort of throw that out there, that it's more than just surveillance. It's also this approach of like a very holistic, comprehensive efficacy evaluation.
So Shawn, I know we've been talking for a while about this topic, but I have one more question that I want to bring up that I'm surprised that we haven't that we haven't gotten to yet. Because Mackenzie, we've had conversations around this in the work that you're doing with GPPC, and a lot of what you read about. has to do with the online sports betting algorithms, and how they may be predatory in nature, and how they may target um, individuals that show signs of problem gambling when in fact they should be sending call this number to get help. I don't know if that's the case or not, but you read about it, you hear about it, these algorithms. And I would have to imagine, well, I know in some of the conversations that we've had, that that's near impossible to actually regulate. And it seems like a real weakness in the regulatory chain, to be able to address from a regulator's perspective. Um, is any of that make sense? Is any of that true? Where are the weaknesses? Is there anything that can be done from the work that you're doing or states are doing, or is this all overblown?
No, from a policy standpoint, yes, there are things you can do. In practice, it's a little bit harder, but yeah, there are things you can do, and I can go into that. From a political standpoint, it's a different conversation, because name any other industry where they're being told you have to identify addiction for your industry, and then you have to prevent it, and then you also have to give them resources. This is the requirement of you to operate. And when we think about algorithms specifically, you know, we're not doing that with social media. We're not doing that with these fast sort of shopping, these online shopping apps, which are just as predatory, right? Like anything that is profit motivated is going to be predatory in nature. And so to sort of silo the gambling industry, like this is actually your requirement, you have to do this, and we're not going to impose that on any other industry. Politically, it's kind of silly, and like it is a different story. From a public policy and like evidence perspective, yeah, we can certainly do this. There is a state that I'm not really going to name because I'm going to say some more about this, but there is a state that tries to do that. I'm sure there are a number of states, but there's one state in particular that I'm aware of that uses sort of markers of harm or indicators of problem gambling. And if any of their players exhibit this behavior, it is incumbent on the sports betting apps specifically. And I guess it's probably not just for sports betting, but I know the examples that they gave me were in sports betting. It is incumbent on the operator to then intervene with a message that has some sort of referral to a problem gambling, or like just like a notice of, hey, you might be escalating into problem gambling type of thing. And the markers that they're using have no evidence base, right? And so, and like they're informed by research, they're informed, but they have not been tested. And this is where I get real angry. They have not been tested. They have not been validated. They are simply good ideas, and they could work in some capacity. I'm sure they're absolutely informed with some expertise from the industry and from responsible gaming associations and things like that, but they are not evidence-based. There is nothing measuring, there's nothing to suggest efficacy. So they're putting this together and they're saying, here, operators, do this, intervene. They've never tested the message that then goes out to the people as part of that intervention. They haven't tested the pathways of which, okay, what is the frequency of which this message should be delivered? At what point in time would this actually change a consumer's behavior? So they're saying, here's our approach to intervening on problem gambling via the algorithm that we think might be, addictive or creating problems of problem gambling in some capacity, right? And so here you go, operator, do your thing. And then when that inevitably does not work, because it is not evidence, there is no validity, they have not been tested and said, yes, this is actually what we should be using moving forward. This will prevent problems. It is somehow the operator's fault. And I just can't wrap my head around that. And that's where sort of I stand on the line of like, the vilification is really silly, in my opinion. I like these portrayals of what's happening in the media are very important. I think that these harrowing tales are very true. I mean, I know that they're very true, but the point that I'm trying to make is like, this problem is so much more complex than one industry being like the big tobacco or like Purdue Pharma. This is really like a really complicated and understudied area that, from a policy perspective or even a programmatic perspective, like the state that I'm talking about, trying to intervene and regulate on that, there are ways forward. It's just going to take a lot of time, a lot of data, and a lot of cooperation and willingness. And I really hope to see that that's the direction they start to go in. But I will say also, from the conversations I've had with operators, they're really in support of doing something, because they're like, well, why are we being vilified? Like, we're sort of doing what every other business is doing. We're just sort of seen now painted as the people that are like evil.
Yeah. Shawn, you ever got a message from DraftKings when you placed the same, you placed like your 7th 5-leg parlay in the same day? What if I got that? I would be like, get out of here, DraftKings. Like, I'm making my bets.
I've noticed a couple of prompts. Some are, and I should sort of disclose, I'm based in Massachusetts, so my experience would be based on their regulatory scheme. But you do get the invitation to say, like, do you want to set limits, daily limits, or which I think is a good sort of prompt. It's sort of like a in your face. You've got to basically. I always click no, of course, but that's my behavior. And then I think there's been somewhere like I log back in to check the bet, and it's like you've been logged in for X amount of time, and it's sort of again like that confrontation. I think is a good pause. But otherwise, they're just like, here's your winnings, and congratulations again for the success that you've experienced. And yeah,
Or you're skillful.
yeah, they're like, do you want to come work for us? I'm like, well, come on, guys, I'm flattered. Like, no, I want to keep playing, but no, but I think that is. I guess what I said earlier though is sort of still rings true is you won't find me at a blackjack table in a casino, but you will find me on a Sunday afternoon or Sunday morning, sort of lining up the day's games and that sort of thing. So in that sense, I'm a customer of a certain segment of gaming, but I understand sort of I don't bet more than I'm willing to lose, and I also get anxious when we talk about like credit cards and people be able to go into debt to sort of gamble. And I just think there's that's when I think a lot of people simplify, like we should legalize sports betting. It's like, sure, I agree. How exactly?
Yeah.
And I think that's where, and the same is true for cannabis. Like we should legalize cannabis. Great. I agree. How exactly? And I think that's where we have lived between all three of us, frankly, is we live in that how aspect of what is appropriate. And I think we're all sort of demonstrated a willingness to learn as we go. And I think that's an admission that the public needs to understand, is that your regulators, try as we might, don't know everything and can't predict everything. And so a lot of this stuff is very much an experiment, which makes me anxious when you're talking about, again, like behavioral choices that people are making and the risk of harm and that sort of thing. But we know that as well, prohibition is probably the worst policy choice of the choices. So.
Yeah, I agree. I think from an implementation science perspective, it's never about making the product available. It's always about how, which is more important. And I think, when sports betting became a thing, or when online gaming became really prolific, it was very much like, okay, this is just like another facet of something that already exists. And so therefore we kind of continue with the status quo. And what I'd like to see now moving forward, just like continuing on compounding on how we need more evidence, is like, there's a bunch of legislation out there currently to tighten up a lot of programs, right? So New Jersey put out for their responsible gaming task force, they put out a request to raise the age limit for all gambling and gaming behaviors from 18 to 21. And what would that do? Like, let's see what that would do. Let's do some studies about how that would impact the market, how that would impact public health outcomes, if that would actually deter behavior, if those already engaging in gaming at 18 would then just go find an illicit opportunity, right? Similarly, the credit card deposits, like, what number should that be at? Should we just ban it? Like, these are all things that can be studied for your unique population. And I see a lot of legislation being put forward of like, well, this is the obvious answer. We just do ban, limit. And we're not really saying, okay, why don't we have a very honest conversation about what we actually think might happen if we do that? And so I'm very much looking forward to being in this space, and I'm glad you guys are with me in some capacity for it. Like, I think it'll be a really, really great endeavor for everybody.
Good luck. We're all counting on you.
No pressure.
Go, team, go. Can we take a break?
Sure.
I need to use the bathroom so bad.
Yeah, we're actually going to keep that in though.
Yeah.
You can't.
So after that quick break, this seems like a good opportunity to segue into our next segment. And, as we were planning this podcast, we were thinking a lot about, you might remember last episode, we did a draft. Also just want to flag that I did choose Pope Francis in the last draft. I, certainly send my respects to the church. And I know that as we record this, they are electing a new pope. So I just want to confirm with your understanding, Erik, that I generically chose the Pope. And so I had the Pope, Oprah, you had, I think, Taylor Swift as like your last pick.
I mean, it was a good pick at the time. It's just unfortunate circumstance for you. I mean, I think we talked specifically about Pope Francis. I mean, I don't know.
I
There's
did
some
say
gray
Pope
area
Francis.
here.
Full
Yeah.
admission, I did say we have tape, so I did say Pope Francis. I'm not going to lie. All right. Well, you know what? I think
it still works.
He's also never been more in the news. So as advertising goes, that's probably the best free advertising. Nonetheless, we do want to try to find some fun segments to do now and then, but we want to make it applicable to life and sort of what folks are doing. So we chose the draft because the NFL draft was happening right around that episode, and the summer months are coming, and cannabis in particular lends itself to a lot of experiences. I would argue, at least, maybe not Erik, that it enhances a lot of experiences. And today, obviously, we talked a lot about gaming and sort of how it can maybe enhance your viewing experience of a sports activity. It might make March Madness more interesting, those sorts of things. But I think the question is, what summer experience would cannabis make better, improve, enhance? Is there an experience? And I used in the intro an example of like going to a concert, and is there cannabis that would make that better? And also, what would that be? So I guess I'm not sure how I want to start. Mackenzie, you are our guest, so I feel like I should probably go to you first as courtesy. I guess the question ultimately is, choose a summer experience, and if you had a choice of cannabis to enhance it, what would it be?
Oh God, I'm like the worst person to ask this question. Schizophrenia runs so deep in my family. like I don't know. I should really.
We could unpack that for a while if you like. Yeah.
Between my bookie uncle and my schizophrenic.
You're burying like the leads here. This is great.
We just have the whole Slade clan on.
Yeah, but with their 700 personalities. So I try to abstain as much as I can and be a little bit more mindful. That being said, in South Carolina, I'm gonna make a plug for a company real quick because I really like them. In South Carolina, there's a hemp beverage, THC, low hemp beverage. I think it's like 3 milligrams per can. And they're called Levity. And I have been enjoying this beverage quite a bit. And I will say I don't do it socially. It is something that I do in my home while I watch Grey's Anatomy. It's a ritual. That's my summer. That's my summer use of cannabis. It's hyper specific. Have you watched Grey's Anatomy? It's the best show arguably ever. If you feel comforted by medical drama.
Who wouldn't? Yeah.
I mean, I think my answer is going to be similar to Mackenzie's here.
Grey's Anatomy.
Grey's Anatomy in a low potency bed.
Cozied up on the couch.
With a nice cozy blanket.
Your slippers.
Yeah, like my favorite summer activities, like golf, first and foremost. But I very rarely drink, let alone use cannabis when I'm golfing, because if I'm always looking to like beat somebody, either my brother-in-law, my dad, a buddy, and I just feel like that would like send me off the rails. Would do a lot of lake swimming. I don't know. I don't know if cannabis or alcohol or really anything would enhance that. Maybe it would. Maybe there's somebody out there.
I feel like there's a public health advisory.
Yeah,
that we have to like I'll have to dub over this and be like, attention listeners.
Don't try this at home.
Yeah.
Don't.
Our insurance carrier has offered the following statement.
But so I guess my answer would be, if and when I do use cannabis, it's usually like a very low dose gummy. And I typically will use it to help me sleep, or like in place of alcohol. Cause once you're 40, for any listener that's under 40, you can't really drink alcohol anymore unless you want to have like 48 hours absolutely destroyed. At least that's my experience in my 40s. So I'm going to go with sleeping in a hammock, which is, if you know me, I absolutely do sleep in a hammock outside on beautiful summer days. So a low dose edible. And if we're calling out like specific, no, I won't do that. It's a Maine product. I'm in Maine. But there is a edibles manufacturer up here in the Portland area that makes wonderful 2.5 milligram, very low dose, very easy. They taste delicious. So low dose edible, nap in a hammock. Beat it.
Wow. You guys have boring summers. This is
No, it's horrible. I thought you were gonna say
yeah.
for sure hot tub, because it seems like every time
Okay.
I talk to you in the summer, you're like, all right, I gotta go to the hot tub. Like, what the fuck?
Well, if ours are boys, what's yours going to be? Show like
Cozy Erik over there. Yeah.
just take some dab rips
Just a
and head to the
dab
mall.
rig. Yep, exactly. Yep. In the garage, just doing a bunch of, construction, and yeah. I love to operate heavy equipment, and yeah, so again, per our insurance carrier, don't do that. No, I think so. A couple of things. I had a couple examples. I thought for sure one of you was going to take one or both, so I sort of had options. I'll therefore use both, I guess. I think a concert or some form of like I don't know, like experience, like a drive-in movie, or again, don't drive though. That again, insurance, yada yada, small print. Um, I think a concert with an edible, I think it just enhances, and I think depending on your tolerance and your sort of, I would say, yeah, just your tolerance, like it enhances the experience. So you don't want to sort of distract from the experience or have like, create any sort of like paranoia. So I think keep starting low, going slow is probably the best way to go. I was going to say golf with a seltzer as your alcohol alternative. I would argue it does. I'm with you, Erik. Although not yet 40, maybe I can feel the early onset 40s, which is to me, alcohol just doesn't do it for me. I don't really love to drink as it is, but I think it loosens me up, and I think I actually play better or freer, and yeah. So for me, I would say golf with a seltzer is certainly a sort of a height of summer for me. And then I do live on a lake. I still wouldn't recommend swimming. Like, I don't know. Wear
Boating.
your floaties, that sort of thing. I haven't napped in a hammock maybe ever, so that might be something to try. It feels like a bit of like a, I don't know, feels like a book to me. Like, I'm trying to think of like the author who's like the summer book author that was famous like a couple years ago. Feels like I picture like a book cover, and it's like Erik sleeping in like a hammock,
just Gundy zonked out.
Yeah,
Nice
it's a real
cool
page turner.
breeze, yeah, lake in the background.
Yeah, I'm sure once we finish this episode, I'll think of the name and I'll text you both with it. But yeah, I think the summer experience, though, again, the takeaway is cannabis can sort of integrate into a lifestyle. We always argue and suggest make good choices, make responsible decisions, but all the same, with summer coming around, it's a good time to think about how these products that are now available legally can enhance that experience. And I think, Mackenzie, you touched on the hemp beverage space as well. I think it's just been that's another phenomenon that maybe we want to dig into soon on an episode, is sort of where are these things coming from, and what's in them, and are they legal, is sort of a pressing question nowadays. So
nicely done.
There it is. There's your summer theme, best summer activity. So we have Grey's Anatomy, hammock, and then actual summer activities like golf and going to a concert. So
you're telling me naps in a hammock aren't a summer activity?
Said what I said.
I feel like this is
who's driving the bus here?
I feel like this is a great opportunity for another listener poll.
Sure. Yeah. I did get your vote in the last one, so thanks. Yeah, you were recorded. Is Grey's Anatomy over? I thought that like the whole series was over.
You know what? It might be. I'm starting from the beginning.
Are you rewatching?
Well,
Okay.
I've never seen it before. This is my first really go of it. And I have a long distance best friend who is like, we need something to like talk about, so you have to watch this with me. And I was like, sure.
New York to Maine, long distance.
Cute.
Did I see what I did there?
You did. Erik, I think that you would probably like cringe at the idea of being one of my best friends.
Yeah. I'm surprised I haven't heard about Grey's Anatomy yet, actually. To tell you the truth.
True.
He's asleep in the hammock. So next up, we do a forever segment, which is trivia, where we try to stump one another. The goal is not necessarily to stump one another.
There you go.
But it's an objective, maybe. It's a risk that we take with offering each other some trivia questions. But again, Mackenzie, you've been very gracious with your time, so we're actually gonna go to you first again. And we should probably, I don't think we have a buzzer, but maybe, is this like a team
Yeah,
approach?
we haven't set the ground rules because for like trivia when we have a guest. So I think it would be Mackenzie asks it, and you and I can work as a team to answer it.
Cool. And
All
then let me just pull up Google real quick. Get this. Okay. All right. So trivia question. We'll go to Mackenzie first. Then Erik will go to you, and then I'll close it out if we feel like doing 3. So Mackenzie, fire away.
Okay, I brought one that is specific to cannabis and gambling because I paid attention to your directions this time as opposed to last time. So there is a term used across both industries. In cannabis, it means to puff on a joint. In gambling, it means to tip out your dealer. What is this term? Great job. Great job. Wow, Erik, you're an idiot. I mean, Shawn got it within 10 seconds.
No, because Shawn's on my team, so I got it within 10 seconds too.
You're right. I'm sorry. I forgot the rules already.
Toke.
Toke, yeah.
I actually, if we're going to be honest, I did not know toke was a term for tipping the dealer.
Mm-hmm.
I have tipped a dealer before. Did not know it was toke.
You toked your dealer?
Toked my dealer.
With a chip or just like cash, just straight cash?
No, I would have been with the chip.
Okay. I usually go all in at some point and lose all my chips, so I feel like that's
You never have that opportunity.
that's
You
tip
might
enough.
We should talk about your gambling behaviors at some point.
All in. I'm all in. Yep. I brought my mortgage and my deed.
I
I'm
bet the
all
house
in.
from the couch.
Yep,
Yeah,
that's
just
it. I
call
brought my
whatever-
couch too. You can have the couch.
Call whatever app he's using. Just be like all those notifications, just all at once. Just send them.
It's all
That's-
offshore anyway. It's
Just-
fine.
That's right.
There was I remember a few years back that was like a big federal intervention on like all the offshore like poker sites and stuff, and it's a big deal. So, Erik, you're next.
All right. So in 2016, there were 4 states that legalized cannabis via ballot initiative. You have Maine and Massachusetts represented here. What were the other 2 states?
California,
That's one.
Maine, Massachusetts, California.
I think it was Nevada, wasn't it?
We are also friends. Yes, you got it.
Nice.
That wasn't like a definite answer. That seemed like a hedge, but I'll give it to you. California.
Well, I was
Nevada.
asking Mackenzie, not you.
Oh,
Team, you forgot the rules too.
yeah.
So, yeah.
Very good.
Great. We know our history.
Mine's not as tough, I think. But I'll ask it anyway. So, Mackenzie, Erik,
Shawn.
which U.S. state was the first to legalize sports betting, and in what year?
New Jersey after PASPA 2018.
Mackenzie said.
Do you want to? Is that your answer, Erik?
Yeah, the way she said that with so much confidence, I'm like, be an idiot not to go with that answer.
Well, can I clarify? Do you mean legalize in terms of like actually in the name of the law we're allowed to license and regulate sportsbook, or do you mean legalize in terms of this is now legal, we're not going to regulate it?
Is there one that you wouldn't know?
The answer would still be New Jersey. It would be just a different date.
I was going for the 2018. The
overturn of PASPA.
yes,
Okay.
correct.
So just a brief background on that. The reason why.
And that's our time.
Yeah, we don't need to go into it, but like shout out Governor Christie, who pursued the overturn of PASPA by trying to make sports betting legal in the state before the Supreme Court said so.
Incredible.
New Jersey, just home to so much.
To the schizophrenics.
Home
And
to
the
so
bookies,
much.
baby. That's right.
Yep. So we covered a lot today. And thank you again, Mackenzie, for your insights, your expertise, for joining us, for being our first guest, by the way. So shout out, first guest on the podcast. We did, when we set off on this journey that we're calling the hybrid, we did indicate we wanted to have guests on. So thank you for taking that plunge with us. And also, we wanted to explore topics that were broader than just cannabis. And I think this was hopefully a success. Well, our listeners will certainly let us know. But yeah, I think like I said, we covered a lot of territory. I think it shows that regulations are not, they don't happen in a vacuum. They don't happen in isolation. States collaborate, work together. Academics get involved. Industry is very active. And the end result, though, is hopefully better, smarter, more successful regulatory schemes and structures. And also it shows that regulators across industries between cannabis, gaming, and other areas can work together, learn from each other. It's not always industry specific, but instead the focus being on public health, safety, and welfare across a variety of industries. So I guess, Mackenzie, Erik, if you want to offer some closing remarks, we can, I guess, land this plane.
No, I would just echo Mackenzie. Thanks for joining us on this Thursday morning. And best of luck to you in GPPC in the work that you're doing. And then Shawn and I will obviously be helpful in any way, shape, or form. So thanks for joining.
Yeah, thanks so much, guys. Appreciate it.
All right. This was another episode of The Hybrid. So thanks everyone for joining us. And as always, be sure to tune in wherever you do get your podcasts, like, subscribe, all those different things. And Erik and I will see you soon, and maybe we'll have some fun guests on the horizon for you then. So thanks, guys.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
The hybrid. The hybrid. The hybrid. The hybrid. The hybrid.